I was fortunate enough to be in Toronto just around the time that Ethereum was getting launched. Funny enough, Ethereum, the very first headquarters on Spadina wasn't that far off from like our physical office of Deloitte downtown. And those guys back then were looking for partners that were, enterprise centric, somebody that could look at it from, big financial, big banking, insurance, healthcare, government, that sort of stuff, and say, what could this technology possibly mean in the context of enterprise?
Hey everyone, really excited to have Kesem Frank on the Unstacked Startups podcast. Kesem was an early partner and advisor to the Ethereum founders, which today has a live market cap of around $190 billion. Subsequently, he became a serial entrepreneur, focusing his efforts on shaping the future of decentralized finance. He currently runs Mavennet, a venture studio specializing in the blockchain arena. I really hope you enjoy what he has to say. Kesem, thanks so much for being here. I gotta ask, you're this individual who grew up in this tiny, tiny country in the middle of the Middle East, on the complete other side of the world from here in Toronto, Canada. How in the world did you end up here in the middle of the Great Lakes, in Toronto, in Canada, as a pioneer in the blockchain space? Take me through it.
At a relatively later age, I was just turning 30, almost back then. I kind of found myself in a completely new environment, new country, definitely new kind of business culture, and I needed to decide what was it that I wanted to do about it. And it's interesting. You could think of it as being a bit overwhelming because all of a sudden you have all these different avenues, all these different trajectories that are, available to you. Could feel a bit confusing. Wasn't that case for me? I don't think. To me, it was exciting. I'm a person that gets extremely, excited about possibilities. And to your question, and I think it's an interesting segue to today's conversation. How is it that we're even having today's conversation? I just ended up finding myself in Toronto, deciding to go back to school, basically create some Canadian credentials around my background back then. Did my MBA at the University of Toronto, got hired off campus into Deloitte. So I spent a couple of years at Deloitte's tech strategy practice, which was phenomenal. And it was actually through that opportunity, through working with Deloitte, that I, for the very first time, have even heard the term blockchain, which is kind of how I've spent my career ever since. Um, it's an interesting path, and it's I kind of double down on the career aspects of it. It's an interesting story. So basically, I was fortunate enough to be in Toronto just around the time that Ethereum was getting launched. Funny enough, Ethereum, the very first headquarters on Spadina wasn't that far off from like our physical office of Deloitte downtown. And those guys back then were looking for partners that were, enterprise centric, somebody that could look at it from, big financial, big banking, insurance, healthcare, government, that sort of stuff, and say, what could this technology possibly mean in the context of enterprise? I think what happened in kind of the thought process I went through was, okay, so I am staring down this technology I think to be profound in terms of what it's going to mean for the world. What am I going to do about it? I could have had a pretty good career staying at Deloitte, selling advisory, consulting, implementation around this technology. But I wanted to do the thing itself. And Elon, if there is one thing that I don't wish on anyone, literally, it's regret. I don't think that it's a healthy thing for us to look back at our lives and say, I could have, I should have, why didn't I? It's very receptive to those really serendipitous type opportunities that life puts in front of you. Being, I guess, structured with how you weigh them, and everyone's different. Obviously, the set of considerations and conditions I would go through are very different than yourself, Elon. But once you did, it takes courage. It takes courage to take that final step. It took courage to, change my career and change my environment, and then quitting on this job that I worked very hard to learn. But if there is one thing that you don't want to go, and at least that's my philosophy, you do not want to go through life feeling is that regret.
Kesem, thanks for sharing that story. And for the audience who maybe isn't as well versed in blockchain technology, can you describe in layman terms what is blockchain? Why is it so profound and potentially transformative to the world and to society?
In really simplistic layman's terms, you should think of a utility that allows us to do away with trust between parties and instead replace it with trust of a system. So I'll put it in very, I hope, simple terms. When you and I, Elon, want to prove anything to each other today, right? Like let's not even go to money. Usually people straight up jump there. Very simple. If I ask an audience, sitting in this room or whatnot, what is the color of Kesem's shirt? Then we go through a very quick survey of everyone that could see me, right? And everybody goes blue, or I don't know, bluish. Quickly, we could establish a consensus. And our ability to establish a consensus is because everybody gets to see me and make up their own mind. If you translate to technology terms, everybody gets to gather their own data. So if I can look at myself and go, it's blue, and I trust the data that I gather, and I trust what I see, then it's very easy to come to a consensus that something is or isn't the way that whatever Kism says it is. That problem becomes an order of magnitude, actually a few orders of magnitude more complicated if you have to go by somebody else. So you can see me, you can make up your own mind, but if somebody that is not part of this goal needs to answer the same simple question, what is the color of Kesem's shirt? Now they don't get to gather their own data. They have to go by you, Eli. And then they have to go through a huge checklist of questions. uh, do I know Elon? Do I trust Elon? Does Elon have a track record of discrepancies? Does he have a financial or otherwise incentive to throw me off? Is he known to tell the truth or not tell the truth? Like, it becomes incredibly complex only because I don't get to gather my own data. So back to your original question, what's the big deal about blockchain? For the very first time, period, we now have the ability with confidence to accept data is valid, even though we did not gather that data ourselves. And the classic example that people kind of think about when they think about blockchain is Bitcoin, right? The very first big scale, large scale application of blockchain. And when you apply what I just said to the Bitcoin blockchain, it's very simple. Even though I am not a participant of the validation chain of the Bitcoin blockchain, I don't know how to set up a node. You know what? When I look at a blockchain explorer that points me to the Bitcoin blockchain, whatever it says, I have an extremely high confidence interval in accepting as valid. That is something that we have not been able to do ever before. So bringing it back to kind of my own personal story, and I'll make it a personal point. When the Ethereum crew basically proposed the concept of a smart contract that allowed us not to just trust data points, rather whole data logic, so whole processes that by themselves become trustless, immutable, transparent because they are on the blockchain, that blew my mind. I said, wow, so much of the work I do today is about how does company A meaningfully interact with company B in a way that makes it compliant for regulatory, for audit purposes, and all that stuff goes away. We could improve it so much by reframing the process to be backed by a smart contract with a blockchain behind it. So that to me was a profound insight. And again, I went down the rabbit hole. This is almost 10 years ago today.
Kesem, you've landed in this space of blockchain. You decide you're going to put your sweat, your tears, everything you got into this, and you start building businesses and startups around this technology. Can you maybe give us, the 1,000-foot view on what you're working on today? And then the follow-up question, what do you look for when you're assembling teams around these problems that you're trying to solve?
A blockchain fundamentally is a network, and it means a bunch of stuff. But to keep this succinct, I'm just going to make one argument. For you to establish a successful network, that network has to benefit from what's called network effects, which means the more people, entities, bodies use that network, the more valuable that network becomes to anyone else, participants and prospects alike. So I try to go after these very specific use cases, verticals that really benefit from network effects. To me, it's it is not easy to sell change to enterprises. Enterprises are usually already successful entities, right? They got big by being good at something they do, and it's incredibly hard for you to be, the small guy standing in front of a boardroom saying, you just need to just change everything you do. You're not going to get very far doing that. Believe me, I tried. The point I'm trying to make is, you need to be very smart with how is it and why is it that these very reluctant to change entities would even grant you audience, let alone listen to you. And what I've been busy with for the past few years actually is a project I'm exceedingly excited about. Basically, it is a DLT, a distributed ledger technology. So an enterprise-esque way of calling a blockchain that is now being adopted by the US government in a very specific context. The US government is branches of the US governments uh, basically regulate everyone and everything that enters the US. A big challenge is just stacking up to the incredible amount, quantities, flows, velocities of things. I'm talking physical goods and commodities, stuff that enters the US. Do I know where it comes from? Who owns it? What does it cost? Is it regulatory compatible? Is it hazardous? There's so many questions about anything that needs to cross into the US, and that's true for most countries. Um, the advantage of tracking and tracing, tracking being knowing for everything where it is at every given moment, and tracing in the sense of being able to very quickly validate the full audit trail as to where did it come from is incredibly powerful in the sense of commerce. What my company, Neoflow, has been doing with the US government is basically applying that proposition, that value proposition, for a very big market, which is the energy market. How do I know that this barrel of oil is not sanctioned? How do I know that the ownership is what it's reported to be? How do I know that its chemical maker is what they say it is? That is without having to constantly check every single commodity. So I like to use this like that for two reasons. One, because you're working with the regulator rather than with the industry, it is very easy, or rather, nothing is easy, but it's easier to inflict change because the regulator has that gravitational pull of what we say goes if you want to do business in the United States of America. So even a very reluctant to change industry tends to say, okay, if that's what the regulator says, that's what we're doing. So that's one. Two, when you kind of think about it, um, it's not really a matter of any individual entity to decide, does this make sense for us, yes or no? Rather, it's something that is binary. It does not exist, but once it goes live, it just tips the entire market.
Fascinating. Yeah. I recall when you were kind of getting going with NeoFlow and your passion for it. And it's really exciting to see where you've gotten it to this point. And no doubt that momentum will only continue. Kesem, can you just tell me a little bit about Mavennet? So Mavennet, you know, and through your work there, my understanding is over the years you've actually founded multiple startups, multiple business. Can you just give me a quick snippet on that?
If I drink the Kool-Aid, and I do, and I literally try to shape my life according to these profound opportunities and be receptive to them, I need to be fair in the sense that I facilitate these type of opportunities when applicable, when appropriate to other people. So when me and my partners started Mavennet, the premise was we have expertise in this transformational technology. We come from working with big enterprise, so we think we have an advantage in terms of how do we work with these type of people, and we were absolutely clueless as to what work we're actually going to do. All we wanted to was to position ourselves in a point that allows us to just be receptive and applicable, relevant, if you will, for those types of opportunities. We started Maven at 5.5 years ago, I want to say. And what we very quickly, organically, Elon, like this wasn't like a grand plan. This was more organically shaped to be. We arrived at a model that we today kind of call a very lean venture studio. So we basically are in the market with our expertise, trying to be helpful for these large enterprises and clients that could use our help. And what this affords us, what this allows us to do, this model, is basically assess hands on directly how big would an opportunity be if we were to kind of reimagine what a business that only focuses on that opportunity looks like. And that has been our model ever since. It really pushes you, like it really broadens the envelope that you have to kind of constantly keep an attention span across multiple activities at a time. It's not for everyone, I can tell you that much. But if it is, if you are the kind of person that lives on that very positive stress, right? That keeps you valuable, on your toes all the time. If you're the kind of person that thrives on that, it is incredibly rewarding. And that is exactly what Mavenet is shaping up to be. And our philosophy, because clearly this is not something I could do by myself. It's not something anyone could do by itself. It's only achievable. It's only possible by really creating an incredible team that all buys into that vision, because it's a hard vision to follow. It takes a lot of dedication. And that kind of brings me to what is it that I think about when I talk to a potential new hire. So I make it my absolute point to talk to every single person that gets hired onto Mavennet. And it's for a very simple reason. I am convinced that the only reason, literally the only reason, that such a small team, by the numbers, we're not a huge team, but the only reason in my mind that such a huge team is able to kind of accomplish and actually over deliver on such audacious scopes of activity is because of our very unique culture. It's because this group, this sum, is much, much, much larger than the sum of all its parts. And that is only achievable if you take absolute care that every person you onboard to your team not just doesn't hurt the culture, rather proactively adds to it, pushes us in a new way, adds something valuable, adds something unique. That is what cultures and teams thrive on. It's this diversity of talent, backgrounds, thoughts, ideas. That's what gets people happy and motivated.
You said at the top of this conversation, I'm looking to solve profound problems, transformational challenges that fundamentally change industries. Mavennet is sort of a lean startup studio, venture studio. You're coming up with problems in the market or ideas. You go through an ideation process, do research on a specific problem that you might be able to build a business around. And then do you go out and hire a team that specifically works on that startup? Or is it Mavennet has, and this is really unique, and that's why I asked, does Mavennet have a bunch of individuals and they're working on a handful of your projects at once? How does that how does that shake out?
Can we identify a unique situation that we think we have the specific expertise and know-how to make a difference on? And again, specifically, I kind of quantify to you, what does it mean make a difference? Make a difference is not make a buck. Make a difference is transform. And I told you how we measure what transformation actually is. And if the answer is yes, how would you do it? Could you actually create an incredibly structured way that makes it feasible, makes it financeable, makes it achievable? Like, it's a very hard criteria to kind of clear. And only if you clear it, you kind of gather everyone in the team and have a very honest conversation as to, do you guys feel like it? Like, do you want to go after this opportunity? Is it something that gets you excited? Because if not, what's the point? Like, why choose something that you are not passionate about? So I know it's a very strange kind of process, but that's kind of how we think about it.